Okay. So the question came up about sushi. Can you eat sushi in a non-kosher restaurant? Can you eat anything in a non-kosher restaurant? What makes things kosher? So we said that fish has to have fins and scales according to the Torah in order to be kosher, and any fish with scales automatically has fins. So if you saw fins and no scales, if you saw a fin, let's say it had been already, the skin had been taken off, but it has a fin sticking out. It might not be a kosher fish. It could be a shark, for instance. Not kosher. It doesn't have scales. But if you see a portion of the skin and it has scales, then you know that it's kosher fish. So we assume in Jewish law that generally you need to be able to ascertain that it's a kosher fish. You can't necessarily take people's word for it. What does that mean? It means you have to be able to see some scales. Now, there are many kashrut organizations that actually do say exactly what Itai said, which is that there are certain fish that their color is such that we can assume they're kosher. And specifically, they usually say salmon. Some of them say maybe tuna also, but the salmon is reddish. And I'm told that there are not other non-kosher fish that have the same look as salmon. Whereas a fish that's white, let's say, you could be bass or tilapia, could also be catfish. You don't know. So, okay. So one thing is to know that it's kosher fish. Now, it's an interesting question. To what extent could you rely on people telling you the truth? Let's say you couldn't. Let's say it was already filleted. Could you rely on, generally we don't rely on that. Just like meat, you would not rely on somebody to tell you it's kosher without knowing that it's kosher, without having some supervision. So to fish, you don't need constant supervision on it because you could know from seeing the skin of the fish, you can know whether it's kosher. So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit easier fish than meat is. Now, for instance, Moshe Feinstein said that you could drink milk in America because you could trust the government. The government has a lot of oversight to make sure that it's cow's milk, not pig milk. And so he said you could drink any milk in America that claims to be cow's milk. You can assume that the government has oversight. Now, could you assume the same thing about, let's say, a fish store? I'm not sure that's true because fish, it's not, what Moshe was talking about was milk produced by companies. It's not necessarily true about a farmer. An individual farmer, there might not be oversight. A big company, there is oversight. So I don't think it would necessarily hold for fish in a restaurant necessarily. Now you could say, do these people, does a restaurant have an investment in serving the right fish? Maybe. But generally, we assume that you have to be able to know either by the look of it, either because it's claimed to be salmon, in which case you could trust that it's kosher fish, or that it has scales, and you can see the scale. Obviously, if they take off the scales, that's fine, but you have to be able to have seen that there was scales. So that's the first question, is to know, is it kosher? What are other possible issues that could come up, let's say, around this question of sushi in a restaurant? What else do you think about?
So is this scenario in a non-kosher restaurant?
Yeah, because if it's a kosher restaurant, we assume that it's under somebody's supervision, and we assume we could eat anything in kosher restaurants.
Right.
Yeah. So this is specifically a non-kosher restaurant. That was the question that came to me.
Okay. So in this situation, would the equipment that it's prepared on be an issue?
Right. So let's say that you have a pot and you cooked something not kosher in it. Let's say you cooked ham in this pot. And then the same pot was used for cooking something, even if the food was kosher. So, there are certain factors which after the fact, we might say that it's okay to eat, like if it was 60 times as much food as the pot, or it had been more than 24 hours since it was last used. But generally, we assume that if somebody's cooked it in a pot that's used for not kosher, that's not kosher. That's right. So one would not, unless it was some kind of situation which was already done or was very difficult, one would assume that you right. So that would be a problem. Now, what's the advantage, of course, of sushi?
The rice will be cooked in a rice cooker.
Let's say that you knew that the rice was cooked in a kosher pot. They had a pot like a rice cooker they only use for rice, and the fish is raw, right? So by definition, it's not cooked. So that's one possibility, right? So that's one What else might we have to worry about?
Well, it's cold most of the time.
Okay, so if this was something that was very hot, let's say the fish was cooked, even if it was a kosher fish, that was cooked in a kosher pot, but it's cut with, let's say, a non-kosher knife, maybe that's a problem. Okay, cross-contamination with tray food. So do you have to worry about that? In other words, in the Talmud, let's say the Talmud was worried that a knife has fat on it from something that was just cut. So that's an interesting question. Do you have to worry about that today? The truth is, I think it's not so much of a worry, actually. If you ever go into a sushi restaurant or you see, sometimes, they have like a special sushi station where you can see the person making it. So I think actually they're very careful about the knife being clean. That's always my sense. So I would imagine even if they cut, a piece of crab or whatever it is, catfish, that probably there is nothing on the knife. Today we could probably assume the knife was clean. Now, if you can see it being made, obviously it's much better. Okay, so you would have to know what kind of fish it is. You'd have to know that either it wasn't cooked, or if something was cooked, it was cooked in a kosher way. Right, I suppose in theory, one could take a piece of fish that was kosher, wrap it twice in tinfoil, and cook it in a non-kosher oven. And there would be grounds to say that you could eat that, because we assume if it's wrapped twice, that the air from the oven, the steam from the oven is not getting in there. Or maybe they cook it on, a couple pieces of tinfoil on top of a fire. So you knew that was a kosher fish, that would probably be okay. Or if they double wrapped a potato like that, probably do that. What else might be an issue? So we have the type, is it a kosher food? What is it cooked in? What's the next issue? There's one other.
So I thought that nothing in a place that is not kosher is actually kosher, because it has to be cooked by a Jew, or if it's cooked by a Gentile, it has to be supervised by a Jew.
Oh, very good. So that's the third problem. The third problem is something called bishul akum, cooking by a non-Jew. Now, even if you knew that it was a kosher fish, and it was either uncooked or it was cooked in a kosher way, or the only thing that was cooked, let's say, was the rice, and you knew that, and probably, I think rice makers only used for rice. I think it's probably true. I might have washed it with a non-kosher sponge, but soap, we assume, kind of ruins the taste of whatever was on the sponge. But the third problem is what Ami's bringing up, which is something called bishul akum, cooking by a non-Jew. So there was a rabbinic decree that one should not eat food. Now, of course, in the old days, it wasn't really restaurants and stuff. You shouldn't eat food cooked by a non-Jew. And it wasn't assuming that it wasn't kosher. It was assuming that you knew it was kosher. But if a Jew did not do any of the cooking, turn on the fire, even if a Jew watched it to make sure it was kosher, if a Jew didn't turn on the fire or stir the pot or something like that, and it was cooked totally by a non-Jew, there was a rabbinic decree that one should not eat it. And it was actually a fence around marrying a non-Jew, because the people that you eat with and you socialize with, it's very easy to end up in a relationship with. It's easier than if you can't, right? So there was this limit on eating. There was also a limit on bread baked by a non-Jew, but the Talmud says that if it's bakery bread and it's cooked, like a factory or a bakery, so a bakery, you're not as worried about eating the food cooked by a non-Jew, baked by a non-Jew. Why is that? Right? In other words, in ancient times, bakeries were one of the only things that was cooked en masse. And so there's this thing called pas palter in Hebrew, bread of the bakery. Why would that be permitted? Why would there be less of a problem with marrying a non-Jew?
Is it because bread is such a staple that it's not really a celebratory thing like wine where people would.
Well, it's interesting. So wine is a slightly different problem, right? Wine was partly not to marry people, but it was also because it might have been poured for an idol, right? That's why boiled wine, which was considered of lesser quality and would not have been poured for an idol, that's why boiled wine was boiled before it was touched by a non-Jew, you could serve it to a non-Jew. Non-Jew could touch it, they could serve it. It doesn't have the same issue of worrying that it might have been poured for an idol, because boiled wine was considered lesser quality and was not used in the temple and was not used for idolatrous worship. That's the issue, is that you can't use things that were used for idolatrous worship. So that's why wine, if you're at a meal and serving wine, so hopefully the person, if you're not Jewish, hopefully the person serving it is thoughtful enough to make sure that it's yayin mivushal, boiled wine. It usually says that on the back of the wine. If it's not, it might be good to let them pour it, if you're not Jewish yet. Because that's, maybe they don't know enough to know, but even though obviously it's not being poured for an idol, there's no idol there in the room, and you're not idolatrous. It's an interesting question. If you live in a world where people are not idolatrous, does that rabbinic decree still apply? So generally, even though today we're not worried about any non-Jew pouring wine for an idol and then reselling it, and it might have been different in the medieval churches where wine was sold in barrels and might have been used in a church service and then sold. That might depend on whether you hold Christianity as idolatry. It's a separate question. But even so, once we have a rabbinic decree, we usually keep the decree even if the reason has gone away. And that's a good example. So bread, though, of a bakery wasn't a danger, and it was a store, a factory. So it wasn't like you're eating in someone's house. In other words, the decree was there to sort of stop you from eating socially. But because bread was sold to the masses from a bakery, so that wasn't a social issue. So the rabbis never made that decree. Now, the truth is, they never imagined today's marketplace, which would be sold to lots of people. It's not an issue. You buy sushi in a restaurant, you're not necessarily eating with the chef, the non-Jewish chef and his daughter or his son, right? That's not really an issue. But we still keep the rabbinic decree. The rabbinic decree wasn't necessarily made on bread of a bakery, but it was made generally on foods. But there were two exceptions. It was not made on foods. It was made on all foods except two kinds of foods. Well, what are those? Do you know?
What was made? Sorry.
So the decree that you mentioned, that you should not eat food cooked by a non-Jew, even if it's kosher food, because you might come to marry them, that applies to food. But there's two criteria that it does not apply. Two criteria of kinds of food that it does not apply to. You know what they are? And again, the term is bishul akum, cooking by a non-Jew. Akum really means an idolater, but so the two criteria are: if it's a food that could have been eaten raw, it doesn't really have to be cooked. So even if a non-Jew cooked it, you could still eat it. And the other thing is, if it is a food that is not considered a food that you would eat at a fancy meal, right? The issue they wanted to prevent against was people eating at a celebration, I think Kate mentioned, together, because that's a good way to end up marrying people. But if this is a food you would not serve, and the term in the Talmud is food that does not go on the table of a king. If it's food that does not go on the table of a king, that could be cooked by a non-Jew and you could eat it. That does not, the decree of not eating food by a non-Jew does not apply to food that you would not put on the table of a king. Now that's obviously food that's considered eaten raw or not is much easier to figure out. But food that is not go on the table of a king is a little harder criterion to figure out. Rabbis have tried to draw specifics around that over time. For instance, the Orech HaShulchan, who wrote a code of Jewish law in the 19th century, he said potatoes do not go on the table of a king. They were considered very pedestrian in their time. It's not on the table of a king. The things that you would not put on the table of a king. Some people think that beans that are from a can, things like from a can, that you would not put on the table of a king. Sometimes, by the way, they'll call the White House and they'll be like, do you ever serve this at a state dinner? Do you serve baked beans at a state dinner? Do you ever serve, the people have done this. Yeah, Kate.
Does this only apply to social, like if you're eating at someone's house?
So if it only, so you're right that we could have made that kind of decree and that would have worked, but they made it on the type of food. So you're right that the purpose of it is that. So there was a rabbi, great posek, great decider of Jewish law, lived in Memphis. in the 20th century. The Rivavos Ephraim, Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt. It's a third grade teacher's entire life, the day school in Memphis, but he wrote about 12 volumes of responsa. He's a great, great scholar of Jewish law. And he writes there that he says, if you have a restaurant that's basically takeout, and the type of vessels they use are vessels that you wouldn't use in a house. These are production vessels, professional vessels. So he says that's like the bread of a bakery. That's not something, it's so removed from eating with the person, eating with the chef. That's considered, factory level, production level. So he says that's not a problem. Some people say that fast food, I think Rabbi Soloveitchik said this. Memphis. So if you Google, it was called the Rivavos Ephraim. That was the name of his books. There are books in Hebrew on Jewish law. Let me find his name for you. Memphis has a long Jewish history. He even has a Wikipedia page. This is his Wikipedia page. He knew a woman in St. Louis. It was not too far from Memphis. Knew a woman in St. Louis who grew up Reform or conservative in Memphis. And she said, she's telling me about her bat mitzvah, that she learned how to read Hebrew for her bat mitzvah. I said, who taught you to read Hebrew? She said, Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, Rivavos Ephraim, this famous rabbi, this great rabbi. She said, I sat in his kitchen and he taught me how to read Hebrew. It's an amazing thing, right? He was obviously a very humble man. He actually lost all his money to Bernie Madoff. And that was, I think that happened to him late in life, believe it or not. But one of his sons is rabbi of synagogue in St. Louis. And his uncle also was a very well-known rabbi. Anyway, so by the way, fish is a very interesting question, right? Let's say a non-Jew cooked fish for you. So could you eat that? Is that a problem of cooking by a non-Jew? Think about the two criteria. Does it go on the table of a king? Probably does. Kings probably eat fish.
Yeah.
So that doesn't help us. Could it be eaten raw?
And
If it's sushi grade fish.
So the truth is, I think this halacha has changed. I think 50 years ago, you couldn't eat fish made by a non-Jew. It was considered cooking by a non-Jew. I think today it's different because fish is often eaten raw. Now, it would have been different if you lived in Japan. Fish is very often eaten raw, even 50 years ago. But in America today, fish often is eaten raw. And I think that actually makes it permitted to eat cooked fish by a non-Jew. As long as you know it's kosher. Again, let's say you're in a pinch, you're traveling somewhere and you can't get any food. So you say to a non-Jew, double wrap this piece of fish. You see that there's scales on it, or maybe it's salmon, you can identify it, and they double wrap for you and they cook it, that'd be okay because it's food that could be eaten raw. But that has changed, I think, over the last 30, 50 years. So there are those who say, I think Rabbi Soloveitchik said this, that fast food, even if it's not the type of food, even if it's the type of food that might end up on the table of a king, let's say meat, but let's say it's a fast food, burger place. So it could be that, according to some opinions, would not be subject to this issue of cooking by a non-Jew because it's fast food. In other words, it's not just the type of food, it's the what we call it. Like, for instance, I had rice is an interesting question. So is rice considered Olal shulchan, right? Rice cannot be eaten raw. Question is, can it go on a king's table? So I assume there's different opinions at this. I mean, the plain, answer would probably be yes. Kings eat rice. You would need a Jew to do something. But I remember there was a fast food restaurant here. It had a sit-down place. It was vegan. I was putting supervision on it. It was called Ta'im. It was in, and they were using a rice cooker. So I spoke to a rabbi, a posek, one who's an expert in Jewish law, and I said, "What do you think of this? Does this need to be turned on by a non-Jew? It'd be very hard for a non-Jew to turn it on because there's not a supervision there all the time." So he said in the name of Rabbi Soloveitchik that if it's a fast food restaurant, that the rice that's made there, even though rice in theory as a product of on the table of kings, we wouldn't consider that a problem. So rice, now some people also say that rice that's plain rice is not what kings serve. And so there could be grounds for using the rice. Yeah. So if you had fish that was cooked and you knew it was cooked kosher, even though it was cooked by a non-Jew, since fish today is eaten raw, you could probably use that. If you have an uncooked fish, but you can identify it as a kosher fish, that should be okay to eat. The rice, I think there's some grounds for. I don't think it's ideal. I think some grounds for. The vegetables certainly are okay. Does the seaweed need supervision? That's an interesting question. So you have to do a little research. Some people thought that there's like an issue maybe with worms in nori, something like that. I'm not sure it's really an issue. You have to look on some of those lists of things that are okay without supervision. Could be that might be okay. Sometimes sushi's without nori. So I think there's some grounds for it. But that doesn't mean that one should do it. What are other potential? There's another potential problem. So let's say that let's say there's a sushi restaurant right near me, Nobu. You ever walk by Nobu on M Street? Mm-hmm. Very fancy sushi restaurant. So let's say that after all I've told you, I determined that a piece of salmon on a bed of rice from Nobu is okay to eat, based on everything we said. So could I go in there and buy it and eat it?
Isn't the fourth layer just being seen in a non-kosher restaurant?
Oh, so we have an issue called marit va'ayin, the way that something is seen by the eye, right? So that's an interesting question. When, right, in other words, maybe the problem is, what's the problem with that? Right, there's two potential issues with me doing something that even though I'm not technically violating a Jewish law, might look like I'm violating Jewish law. What are the two possible issues with that? Why is that forbidden? Why is that a problem?
Because someone else may see that, that you're going in a non-kosher restaurant.
Why is that a problem? Besides that, I'll lose my job.
Why is that a problem?
Then they probably think it's okay for them to do.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's one possibility, right? That's one reason for marit ayin. Other people will say, "Oh, Nobu must be kosher. The rabbi went in there." You know that joke about it's an old joke about a guy, Mr. Schwartz. He's the rabbi is walking by the non-kosher restaurant. He sees Mr. Schwartz sitting in the restaurant. You can see him through the window. He's got a big pig. They brought him a big roast pig. And he can't believe it. He thought Mr. Schwartz so religious. They let him lead the davening on Yom Kippur. Rabbi goes in the restaurant and says, "Mr. Schwartz, how could you do this? You're eating a roast pig." Mr. Schwartz says, "Rabbi, I ordered a baked apple. Look how they serve it." So I guess roasted pigs come with an apple in their mouth. You ever heard of that? I think it's like a Hawaiian thing. I don't know. Anyway, you have to know that part of it to get the joke. Old joke, very old joke. So, right, so that's, so obviously we should judge people favorably, that's true. But there is a concept of marit ayin. So one possibility is people think it's kosher. The other possibility is that, and this is the other reason for marit ayin, we should not put ourselves in situations in which people think that we're doing something forbidden, even if things aren't permitted, because it makes us look bad. So that's another reason. Those are the two reasons in Jewish law. But the question, of course, is where do you draw the line? Can you go to the bathroom in a McDonald's, right? do I have to worry that people will assume that I'm eating McDonald's? So it depends, right? It depends what the general assumption is. I think for this is not something so set in stone. You have to know sort of what's the, right? If you live in a place where lots of Jews are eating, fruit bowls in a kosher restaurant at a business meeting, or, they're getting kosher food brought in, that's not so uncommon. So therefore the burden of proof is on the person who sees it. In other words, if you can easily assume that, if you can easily assume this person went in to go to the bathroom, this person, so then that's probably not a problem on our side. So a lot of these things also depend on the situation a person is in. There are certain things in Jewish law that we might allow b'shat hadachak, at a time of great need.
Yeah,
Let's say a person's traveling, very hard to get kosher food. So based on what we said, I think that might be grounds for, again, you have to be careful about all the Jewish law parts that we discussed. But generally, I think if we can get other food, we would not buy sushi in a kosher restaurant, because it's not ideal. Could be a problem. But if you can take care of all those problems, then it's probably okay. And it depends on kind of what the situation is. And I'm not sure I'd make an everyday thing. Person has to also know kind of where they're at as an individual. I don't think we can violate Jewish law, but again, I think there are grounds for if you can write all those factors. We can tell what kind of fish it is, and determine that it's kosher fish, either by seeing the scales or seeing that it's salmon. It looks like salmon. The rice. Again, the rice bishalakim, I think there's some grounds to rely on. I don't think everybody would agree. What else do we say? Mara science, then you have to figure out, is it a place where people might eat kosher food in a non-kosher restaurant? Or that sort of thing. Yeah, Madison.
I have a question on the rice.
Yeah.
So with checking vegetables, would that be an issue with that, or would cooking it in a certain manner constitute, would that be satisfied?
You mean for checking for bugs, I mean?
Yeah.
So rice, we can assume, is very clean.
Okay.
Rice, I don't think you have to check. I mean, in the old days, like on Pesach, Sephardic Jews who eat rice check very, very carefully to make sure there's no wheat grains. Because wheat, of course, can become leaven, even though rice cannot. Ashkenaz Jews don't eat rice on Pesach. But I don't think rice. I mean, you have to know what the mitziut, what the actuality is. If you live in a place where there are bugs in the rice, then you got to check it. And generally they're not putting vegetables that might have bugs in them in sushi. That's like carrots and cucumbers. That's good.
I have a question about the Marasayan consideration. So in the last couple of years, there have been a proliferation of sort of like meat alternative products like Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger and the like. So how would that apply to those products? You're probably familiar with this Impossible Pork product that's coming out. And there was a question about if it would get a heksher or not because of the name.
Yeah, it's weird. I could not understand what like the OU or whoever it was the issue is with Impossible Pork when they put, they are willing to put it on, bacon bits or that are made out of. They've been doing that for 20 years. I don't see why pork is different, right? In other words, if you live in a world where everybody assumes that that half the meat is fake, so what are they worried about? So I don't know what the issue is there. So this actually goes back, this question, a very long way. I'll show you. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let me ask you, in the old days, did they have any problem like this? Take a look at this piece of Shulchan Aruch. By the way, when I was young, they invented Parav milk. It was called non-dairy creamer. It wasn't very good. It was called like Riches. I think Riches. You had to keep it frozen. It was probably made out of soy. Goldners might also might remember this, but it was terrible. And people, when I was a kid, there was no Parav ice cream. It just didn't exist. There was no such idea even. There was like sherbet, or there was like, ices, but just no such thing. There wasn't soy milk. There wasn't. And the first time, I think I was like 8 years old or something. First time somebody made me on Shabbos, they served Parav ice cream, and it was like, it was not good at all. I don't know what it was made out of. It was probably all chemicals. But now, obviously, it's totally different. You can get Parav ice cream that tastes like real ice cream, which it does really sell. But this question actually goes all the way back to the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch writes, he's writing here also another interesting thing, which is the question of, are you allowed to get benefit from milk and meat cooked together? So take a look. It's written in the Torah, Lo tova shel gedi b'chleim. We shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Smaller so you can see it. Right, it says 3 times in the Torah, do not cook a kid, a goat in its mother's milk. Why does it do it 3 times? The Talmud says 3 times in order to tell you 3 things. Number 1, that you're not allowed to cook it together. You can't cook together meat and milk. Even if you're not going to eat it, you can't cook it together. That you can't eat it once it was cooked together. And meat and milk that was cooked together, you can't get benefit from. That's why it's mentioned 3 times in the Torah. Prohibition of eating is presented in the language of cooking. So there's no prohibition of Torah in regard to meat and milk unless it's cooked together. Rabbinically, even if it's mixed together, that's a problem. But biblically, milk and meat are only forbidden if they're cooked together, because it says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, Gedi, not just a goat, it applies to other kinds of animals also. An ox, a sheep, goat. There's no difference if the milk is of that mother of that animal or of another mother of any of these animals. By the way, these are animals that nurse, right? Animals that nurse here. This law applies with meat from a kosher animal. That doesn't really say kosher. It says tahora, a pure animal. Meaning, this animal might not have been slaughtered correctly, but if it's a type of animal that's kosher, that's what mixing milk and meat applies to. You can't cook together beef and milk. But by the way, pig and milk, ham and milk, you could cook together. That's not forbidden to cook. You can't eat it out, it's not kosher, but the forbiddenness of milk and meat cooked together is not applied to non-kosher meat, only to kosher.
Can you derive benefit from it?
Yes, so if you cooked, in theory, if you cooked the non-kosher meat and milk, you could derive benefit from it.
Interesting.
Because the whole idea of cooking kosher, of meat and milk applies to kosher. In other words, again, it might not be actually kosher, it might not have been slaughtered correctly, but the type of animal that's a behemoth tahora, kosher animal. But meat of a kosher animal that was cooked in milk from a non-kosher animal, or meat from a non-kosher animal cooked in milk from a kosher animal, it's permitted to cook and to benefit from. Right? You're not allowed to eat it because it's not kosher, and the milk's not kosher.
So what would be benefiting from it? What would be an example?
Selling it. Let's say you want to work.
Okay.
I mean, in other words, it could be a very big halachic problem to work in a McDonald's, because if you have to cook a meat patty with cheese on it, and meat patties from beef, it's a kosher type of animal, and the milk is from cow milk, that could be a problem. It could be a real problem. What about owning such a restaurant? What about owning stock in McDonald's? That's an interesting question. That's probably less of a problem. Fish and grasshoppers are not prohibited with milk, even rabbinically. Now, the Rama, or the Moshe Isserlis, says an interesting thing. Right? When did Rabbi Moshe Isserlis live? He lived not long after Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo in the late 1400s. Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Rama, lives in Ashkenaz. He lives in Eastern Europe, and so he gives you the Eastern European take on things. But he doesn't live much. He only lives about 50 years later than the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So he says, "V'nohagu lasos cholav mishkedim." We have a custom here in Eastern Europe to make milk from almonds and to put bird meat, to cook it with bird meat. Since, he says, even cooking a bird with real milk, with cow's milk, is only rabbinic. So he says, therefore, almond milk, which is, not forbidden really at all, it's from almonds. He says that's certainly permitted, and we do that. But it's interesting. He says, but meat from an animal, not a bird, from an animal, let's say from a cow, beef. If you want to serve that with almond milk, what do you have to do? You have to put next to this, you've cooked some beef in almond milk. So people are going to come in, they're going to say, hey, what is this? You're cooking milk and meat together. So what do you have to do? You have to place some almonds next to the milk, right? You're serving milk, let's say, with your beef, or you made dessert out of almond milk after a meat meal. Put some almonds on the table. Why? So people know that this is almond milk, and not that's not forbidden.
Are you allowed to just tell people, or do you have to
So it's interesting, right? Why does he say if to actually put them? Why can't you just tell people? So one possibility might be people walking by. Another possibility is you might forget. So we like to codify things. So when I was a kid and nobody had ever heard of milk that wasn't dairy, when this product came out, this Riches, that was like the first par of milk product. Was in the freezer section. So everybody who served, this is the late 1970s. I mean, so on Shabbos, it wasn't crazy to serve it because people would serve a meat meal on Shabbos. And then people wanted to drink coffee. And so, until that time, you had, for some reason, almond milk wasn't around really. I don't know, when I was a kid, but they had this Riches. And I don't know, people who needed milk in their coffee after a meat meal just didn't drink coffee, I guess. So whenever people would serve this kind of milk, they would always put the Riches carton on the table. I mean, Shabbos tables, I always saw that. Because so why did they didn't serve it, from the kitchen. They didn't put it in a pitcher. They would put the container on. I think it's this halacha, this Jewish law. It's the same as the almonds. In other words, but that was the beginning of it, right? Today, if you serve, dessert that's made out of almond milk or soy milk, or you serve par of ice cream, I don't think you have to put the ice cream container on the table. Why? What's changed in 30 years, 40 years? Right? Why? When you serve almond milk after a meat meal today, you don't have to put almonds. No, have you ever seen anybody put almonds on the table? Never, right? Why not? It's in Shulchan Aruch. It's in the code of Jewish law. What's the answer? Right? This is a maritime issue.
I don't know, maybe just like how 50 years ago, the fish and eating it raw is different than today. Like today, milk replacers are incredibly common.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly what it is. Right. Now, this is a maritime issue. This is the issue of the way that it looks. So today you serve almond milk with a meat meal. You don't have to put it on the table. Everybody knows because half the world drinks it. Today more people drink almond milk than men. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's very common. So in other words, maris and how it looks does depend how it looks. That is a factor. This is a Sephardic commentary. Interesting. He says you should do it with, remember the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles had said, if you serve chicken with this almond milk, you don't have to put almonds on the table because chicken with milk is only rabbinically forbidden. So here it's another step. But he says, no, you should do it with both. Because it's still going to look like you're violating something rabbinic. Interesting. He says, if you don't have any almonds, you can still eat it. That's interesting. He also quotes all these different things that people used to eat. He says in Constantinople, they would eat rice that was cooked in almond milk after meat. And he says also people eat grape leaves with milk and almond milk. And he says already people have seen this and nobody seems to get upset. Sounds like even without almonds on the table. It started to change already at his time. When is he from? Let's see. Was written. It's a Sephardi. By Yaakov Chaim Sofer. Oh, very late. It's the 1900s already. So already in the 1900s, he's saying, you know what? There's a lot of different places where they make things out of almond milk. Constantinople, they're making rice out of almond milk and meat, and they're serving it after meat. And you're making grape leaves on milk, and people are not putting almonds on the table. It's understood, right? So that's the change over time. This is interesting, by the way. It is forbidden to cook breast milk with meat. Now, breast milk and meat really is permitted to be cooked. In other words, it's not an animal, it's a person. So the law of milk and meat, of don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, does not apply, just like it doesn't apply to almond milk, and it doesn't apply to non-kosher animal milk, and it doesn't apply to an animal that doesn't nurse, it does not apply to a human being either. So in theory, if a pot of meat and some breast milk falls in it, that's okay. But we don't cook it together because of how it's going to look. And he says if it fell into a pot, you don't have to worry about it because it's not really a problem with milk and meat. It's not the kind of milk the Torah is talking about. The Torah is talking about cooking an animal's milk. So he says, if you're worried about how that looks, then certainly you should be worried about cooking non-kosher milk with kosher meat, even though it's not specifically forbidden biblically, you worry about how it looks. One time when my first child was very young, he was nursing, he was like 6 months old, and we had a bottle of expressed breast milk. And we went to a kosher Chinese restaurant, I don't know where, I think it was New York or Chicago or something. And the mashgiach comes out, he's like, you can't bring that bottle of milk in here. And I'm like, it's breast milk, it's no problem. And he's like, forget it, you still can't. So, because it's, I guess that's that halacha how it looked. Okay. Very good. Very good page. I think you're right. Breast milk would be another thing that is kosher, even though it does not come from kosher. Yeah, very good. But actually, that's dependent on an interesting question, which is the question of, and this sounds a little disgusting, is human flesh unkosher? It's not, you're not allowed to eat it. It's considered disgusting. Obviously can't kill somebody. But let's say you're on a desert island and you're starving to death and you have two choices. Somebody died, you could eat their flesh, or you could eat the flesh of a non-kosher animal. Which one is better to eat? That would be the question.
Non-kosher animal.
I'm not sure that's the answer.
Oh.
So I think actually, I think that in Jewish law, that actually human flesh, it's not unkosher. I wouldn't say it's permitted. It's certainly a desecration of the body. It's certain things that are considered disgusting, like eating a live fish, even though it may not be forbidden halakhically, but certain things that are forbidden because they're disgusting. But don't think that you would necessarily. You're right. At first glance, I think you're right that this is something kosher that comes from a non-kosher being. We're not sure that humans. In other words, they're just not they're just not part of the category. It's not that a non-kosher. It's not the fact that kosher animals that the Torah lists are kosher and everything else is not kosher. Everything is kosher except for that which the Torah forbids. Right? Now, the Torah doesn't tell you that carrots are kosher, but it tells you that certain kinds of animals are not kosher. So that would be. Look and see. Sure, if you Google it, you'll find some sources for this question. Okay, so does that basically answer the sushi question? It's not a very clear answer. I mean, it's not very cut and dried, but
No, that is very helpful, and hopefully I will never be in the situation where I'm debating eating another person anyway. So
yeah, no, I was thinking of the sushi question.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was not. You should. I hope you're never in such a situation. But although unfortunately Jews were, it's funny. One of the keynotes. I mean, one of the curses in the Torah actually. If you look in the book of Numbers, one of the curses in the Torah that says the Jewish people, if they don't keep the Torah, they'll be kicked out of the land, they'll be exiled, their enemies pursue them. And one of the terrible curses in the Torah is the curses in Devarim. Terrible things the Torah lists that will happen to the Jewish people if they don't keep the Torah as a nation. And, I have to go to Mincha. Let's not do this now. Okay, but it's actually appropriate for Tisha B'Av because one of the things that talks about on Tisha B'Av in the Lamentations is that people were starving to death in the siege of Jerusalem, and that the Torah's curse that even the Gentile woman will eat or have to eat, will be starving and eat the flesh of their children who've died. We see that in the Torah in Deuteronomy. The curses that seems like that did come true at certain times in Jewish history. There were terrible, terrible, dark times in Jewish history, all through Jewish history, certainly during the Holocaust, other times. Okay. So next week and the week after, instead of our online class, I'm going to be teaching. We're going to do a Beit Midrash at Shul from 6:30 to 8. There'll be dinner, and from 6:30 to 7, and 7 to 8, they'll be learning about Tisha B'Av, about the 9th of Av in 3 weeks. And I'll be facilitating some kashrut learning, some partner learning, and then a class, short class. So we'll be doing that instead of this class for the next 2 weeks. I don't know if it's going to be conducive to put that on Zoom though, because a lot of the kashrut study. If I can put part of it, but we will be having that class in Shul the next 2 weeks. Okay, have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.